about growth. We don't challenge the notion that growth is good, but are we breeding and consuming our way to extinction, and what's it going to take for us to recalibrate our expectations in a finite world?
Well, first of all, again, we should be careful to think about consumerism and the consumption culture. That's to a large extent artificially created, and not my opinion. You go back to the, say, a century, to the origins of the public relations industry, including the advertising industry. It's an interesting history. Back around a century ago, in the freest countries in the world, England and the United States, there was a recognition, conscious, articulated recognition on elite sectors, that enough freedom has been won by popular struggle so that people can't be controlled by force anymore. So there have to be other ways to control them. And the other way to control them is control of attitudes and opinions. That's when you get the call for manufacture of consent on the part of progressive intellectuals, the Wilsonian, Roosevelt progressives, and so on. We have to have manufacture of consent, but we also have to have creation of wants. People have to be driven to the more superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption. Actually, I'm quoting from the business press, because that way we can control people. If we can fabricate wants, that's the term used by the great political economist Thorstein Veblen, who understood this and wrote about it. If we can fabricate wants, create wants, we can trap people. We can trap people into consumerism, debt, and so on. And it's very interesting the way this was done. If there was time, I could go into it. So to a large extent, we live in a culture which, in a society in which enormous resources are devoted to fabricating wants. I mean, if you take a look at, I presume it's the same here as in the United States, if you look at a television directed to infants, 2-year-olds, it's already trying to create a culture of demand goods. In fact, there's now an academic discipline, part of applied psychology, which is concerned with nagging, literally. The reason is the advertising industry recognized a couple of decades ago that there's a big part of the population that doesn't have any money, so they can't buy, so we got to do something to make them buy. And the way that's children, and the way they can buy is by nagging their parents. So it's, I got to have that video cam, whatever it is. And so the advertising aimed at children, television and so on, devises various types of nagging that can be used for different kinds of purchases. Well, the point is, the idea is to trap infants, children, into a culture of fabricated wants, so they can then be trapped into a consumer culture, and then they can be effectively controlled, along with manufacturing of opinions. All very conscious, incidentally. There's some quite good studies of this if you're interested. One very good book by a Canadian law professor, Joel Bacon, has just come out. I forget what it's called, something about stealing childhood or something like that. It's a very concerted effort. But quite apart from that, suppose we are, to some extent, trapped in it. How do we react to the fact that, of course, as you say, it's a finite world, finite resources, we're going to hit limits? Well, there's two ways. One is the way of the lemmings. We just march happily toward the cliff, and then when it turns out there's a cliff, we go over it and we're finished. Well, that's one way to react. And that's what the business world is driving us to, for the purposes of short-term profit.
But they're going to fall off too.
They'll fall off too, but you don't think about that. If you're literally. So, for example, in the United States, quite openly, the Chamber of Commerce, the main business lobby, American Petroleum Institute, and others, are very openly, they say it, organizing propaganda efforts to convince people that global warming is a liberal myth. And it's affected popular opinion. You can see the polls reacting as the campaign continues. Now, the people who are running this campaign as individuals probably share your attitudes. And maybe they're members of the Sierra Club and they contribute to environmental programs. But in the capacity of a CEO of a corporation, you have a duty that you must perform. If you don't perform it, you're out and someone else is in. This is an institutional property, much harder to deal with. The property is you have to maximize short-term profit and market share. In fact, that's a legal requirement in Anglo-American law. If you don't do that, you're displaced, somebody else comes in. So there's an institutional imperative to destroy the planet, to march off the cliff. That's a serious problem. It traces back to well-known inefficiencies of market systems, which you probably learn about in your first economics course. They ignore externalities, technically. And that's a built-in institutional property, and it does lead to the leaders of the lemmings knowing that they're going to fall off the cliff too. But we don't have to be lemmings. I mean, we can deal with these problems sensibly. Consuming more of the world's resources is the advertising industry's image of happiness, but it doesn't have to be ours. And I think any sensible person